Good morning. I would encourage you to turn in your Bibles to Acts chapter 12. We'll continue preaching through our series here on Acts. And here in Acts chapter 12, we'll see the power of prayer as God defeats the wicked ruler Herod. Now, if we take a brief step back just to get our bearings on Acts, of course, Acts is the sort of Luke part 2. We have the Gospel of Luke, and then Luke continues his history to talk about the early history of the church. And so the church just keeps growing and growing, and the big notable thing we've just encountered here has been in chapters 10 and 11 with Cornelius and the first Gentiles being converted, and then even more Gentiles in Antioch as well. And so some of the conflicts that are coming from that, this is maybe a bit of a subtext, but it plays out in what we're about to look at, is that the Jewish people, of course there were Jewish Christians, but then there were Jewish people who were rejecting Jesus as the Messiah. So these Jewish people who were rejecting Jesus were sort of, they didn't like the Christians. They were this new sect of, like there were Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes, and now there's these Christians. But they were sort of getting along with them and recognizing them as a sect. But now that they are incorporating Gentiles, non-Jewish people, into being this sect of Jews, well, you're not Jews at all. And so it becomes more of a conflict. And so this leads to this persecution that we'll see here in chapter 12. We'll see God has power over these things. And as we consider the power of prayer, we'll see how it relates to Herod, this wicked king. And so he's persecuting the church, but then Herod is defeated. And this is all really through the power of prayer and the power of God, but the Christians who are petitioning God on their behalf. So let's just start by reading our text from Acts chapter 12, just the entire chapter, 1 through 25. And I'll be reading from the Legacy Standard Bible, and you're welcome to follow along in your text or here on the screen. It says here in verse 1, "Now about that time Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to harm them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. When he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. Now on that very night, when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell. And he struck Peter's side and woke him up, saying, 'Rise up quickly!' And his chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, 'Gird yourself and put on your sandals.' And he did so. And he said to him, 'Wrap your garment around yourself and follow me.' And he went out and continued to follow. And he did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but was thinking he was seeing a vision. And when they had passed the first and the second guard posts, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. When Peter came to himself, he said, 'Now truly I know that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting.' And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. And when he knocked at the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. And when she recognized Peter's voice, because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but she ran in and reported that Peter was standing in front of the gate. And they said to her, "You are out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so. They kept saying, "It is his angel." But Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the door, they saw him and were astounded. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he recounted to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. And he said, "Report these things to James and the brothers." Then he left and went to another place. Now when day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. And when Herod had searched for him and had not found him, he examined the guards and ordered that they be led away to execution. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. Now he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and with one accord they came to him. And having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace, because their country was fed by the king's country. And on an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel and sitting on the judgment seat, began delivering an address to them. And the assembly kept crying out, "The voice of a God, and not of a man." And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give God the glory. And he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. But the word of the Lord continued to grow and be multiplied. And Barnabas and Saul returned to Jerusalem, fulfilling their ministry, taking along with them John, who was also called Mark. So the first thing we want to think about in all of this is, who was King Herod? It's kind of like Pharaoh. Which Pharaoh is it anyway? Depending on what part of the Bible you're looking at, there's a different person who's serving in the role as Pharaoh. That was sort of like a title of the king of Egypt, whereas this is more of a family name, a ruler, maybe in our country, the Kennedys or something, the different Bushes that were present. We might think of that. But there's these different rulers in the family name of Herod. So in this text, this Herod that's referred to is Herod Agrippa I. So this Herod family, they were Idumean or Edomite. Basically, they were from the line of Esau instead of the line of Jacob or Israel. So they weren't Israelites, but they were this family of rulers. And this could be kind of confusing. And so put this little chart here that maybe helps a little bit. So at the top of that, the beginning of this great in terms of maybe the world, they were these great rulers. Herod the Great was the first of them, and he had this large kingdom in this area. And this is the one, as we read like the beginning of the Gospels and the birth of Jesus, this is the Herod who was killing the babies in Bethlehem, trying to kill Jesus as a baby. And then Herod Antipas down here would be his son, and he's the one who took his brother's Philip's wife and Herodias, and then killed John the Baptizer and all of this at the time of Jesus' ministry. That's sort of the context there. But then now we're talking about Herod Agrippa I. So kind of weird generations there, but this is the grandson of Herod the Great. So there's just all these different people. So just try to keep that in mind. And then we talked in our class, we mentioned about Agrippa, and that's another Agrippa II that talked to Paul later on, just to make it more confusing. So a lot of different people there. But Herod is persecuting the church. Herod Agrippa I specifically is the one persecuting the church. And in persecuting the church, he specifically persecutes James is the big one, where he kills him here. We see in verse 1, Herod is laying hands on some belonging to the church, so this general persecution of Christians in order to harm them. He's trying to put a stop to these Christians and give them a hard time. And in verse 2, James, the brother of John, so one of the apostles, right? So Peter, Andrew, James, and John, this is the James we're talking about here. He was put to death with a sword. So this is a horrible thing for the Christians and their new leadership. Jesus has gone on to heaven, and these apostles are leading the early church, and now one of their leaders and the apostle James was murdered killed by this wicked Herod Agrippa. Or what did I say? Agrippa the first? I'm already losing track of which one it is. Anyway, this Herod kills James. And so he goes on then to build upon this, and he's also now going to persecute and try to kill Peter. We see that in verse 3. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, that we killed James here, well, let's do more. He proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. And that's notable because they're not going to do these executions during the feast time. So it kind of gives this waiting period where he's imprisoned and these events we're going to see occur. So when he had seized him, he put him in prison because they're waiting there, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers. And so this would be 4 sets of 4. So this is like 16 soldiers that would be on shifts, but probably 4 at a time. But they would probably over the course of 24 hours, they would go on 2 shifts each. So they have like 3 hours. So they're always going to be fresh. They're not going to be tired and all this kind of thing. And so these guys were accountable to the prisoner, and it was the standard thing. If they would lose a prisoner, then they would have whatever the prisoner was supposed to have as punishment, oftentimes execution. Of course, we see that's what occurs here. So they're very incentivized to watch and not let their prisoner get away. And maybe this seems like overkill to have 16 people dedicated to this over the course of a day. But you remember in Acts chapter 5, Peter had escaped prison before, again by the angel of the Lord. So maybe they knew that, and we really need to make sure we don't let this guy escape. But of course, the power of God cannot be thwarted. And so that's where we start to talk about the power of prayer. Here, even in our text, we see the power of prayer in verse 5. So Peter was kept in prison. He's there, stuck in prison. But prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. So these Christians they're not there able to, go storm the castle or anything, but they're able to quietly together pray for their dear brother Peter. And they already saw what happened to James. And maybe even take a side note here, presumably they prayed for James too. We all pray for one another. And we might wonder, well, why wasn't James saved physically? Of course, that's difficult. They probably wanted him to not be killed, but we're promised, of course, eternal life, not promised physical rescue all the time. But we still ask God for these things, and sometimes he chooses to do that, sometimes not, but it's all to his glory and all to his plan. And so, but here we see with Peter, they pray and they get a better result. So of course, for us, we need to make sure that regardless of what we might think actually will happen, we need to make sure that we're fervently praying to God for some of the things we even talked about in our prayer list this morning, different people with health problems and different things. But maybe we would ask, even skeptically, well, what can prayer do? As we think about Herod's power as a king, on the one hand, he has this physical power. They can't do anything to go and physically stop him. There's all these soldiers that any one of them could kill somebody trying to come there, and the prison walls are basically impenetrable, and the iron gates, it's all locked up. But you compare that with the church's power, really God's power, through prayer. It doesn't seem like these weak people sitting there with their hands like this are going to have any ability to defeat the great king and all of those physical things. But of course, God's power is more than these physical things. James tells us in James 5:16 that the effective prayer of a righteous man can accomplish much as it is working. And Jesus tells us in Matthew 21, verse 22, and in all things you ask in prayer, believing you will receive. In 1 Thessalonians 5:17, Paul simply says, to pray without ceasing. Just keep praying. We might be discouraged at times, but we need to keep praying. And we have this example here where Herod is defeated, and as these people prayed for Peter to be delivered. So there in verse 6, and that very night that he was going to bring him out and have this execution publicly happening here, Peter was sleeping. sleeping that night before this is going to occur. And he's just sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and guards in front of the door were watching the prisoners. They're just kind of emphasizing, there's no way he's going to get out of here. He's not just hiding there and maybe he can dig through the rock or something and escape. No, there's soldiers there, and it's well guarded, and he's basically trapped in there physically. So we could even think about that visually. There's these guards there. He's chained them, but it's interesting that he's sleeping, right? Well, it's nighttime, so of course he's sleeping. But wouldn't you be kind of worried? I think from a human perspective, we might think maybe you'd be up all night worried. It would be a reaction we might have. But Peter has this confidence where he's even able to sleep. And John chapter 21, verses 18 and 19, Jesus made some comments about how Peter would die. And he talked about how in his old age he would die. And so if Peter latched onto that and recognized, well, I'm still a younger man. This isn't my time. God's going to, in some way, pull me through this. So perhaps that's why he was still able to just sleep in the midst of his imminent execution from a physical standpoint. David wrote in the Psalms, Psalm 139, verses 7 through 10, perhaps some things that Peter was also thinking about and that we should be thinking about when we go through these hard times. In Psalm 139, verse 7, David says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. Or if I make my bed in Sheol or the grave or Hades, or however we want to say that, you are there. If I lift up the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay a hold of me." So we should keep those things in mind, that God is all present and all powerful and can take care of us, and God's going to do whatever he thinks needs done. So in this situation where he's stuck there in prison, of course, what happens? Verse 7, the angel of the Lord, again, we saw the angel of the Lord helping him in chapter 5. But here in chapter 12 now, the angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell. Just imagine that brilliance of that going on there in the cell. And he struck Peter's side. Struck him in a good way here. We'll see him striking Herod later, but he's striking Peter's side and woke him up, saying, "Rise up quickly, let's go, let's get out of here. Get your shoes." The chains miraculously fall off, and he tells him to, gather up your garments and get your shoes and let's follow me, let's get out of here. And so Peter does that. He follows along, and he went out and he continued to follow, and he did not know, didn't realize this was real. Is this just a dream, or what's going on? He was thinking he was seeing a vision. And when they had passed the first and second guard posts, and again thinking about these guards, there were two of these four in there in the cell with him, but then there was one like right at the outside the cell, and then there's one like at the next gate out. So that's where the four would have been. So he's going past the first and the second guard post. He came to the iron gate that leads into the city. So the prison walls leading out into Jerusalem where they were, which opened for them by itself. It's an automatic gate. That maybe wouldn't surprise us today with electronics or something, but that was not a thing, obviously, back then. And so this was a miraculous ability for God to just see to it that this gate would just open by itself, even though it was locked securely. And they went out and went along the street, and immediately the angel departed from him. So he's suddenly by himself after all this happened. So, we have this angel appears, and there's the bright light. He hits him and gets this, the chains fall off. They pass the guards, they get out, the gate opens by itself, and then he's by himself. And verse 11 says, when Peter came to himself, what just happened kind of thing, he said, "Now I know that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." Of course, they were expecting him to be killed, just like James, the other apostle, had been killed. So we see Herod's plans are defeated. Herod is defeated, and he gets increasingly defeated as we go along here. But of course, but how was his plans defeated? Well, of course, it's through the power of prayer, the power of God. Verse 12, and when Peter realized that this all truly happened, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who is also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. So we already knew these Christians were praying, and now we know where they were. They're at the house of Mary. So he goes there. And then when he knocked at the door of the gate, so not maybe the door of the house like we would think, but like the outer gate, and then the house would be inside there. The servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. And when she recognized Peter's voice, so she heard his voice, didn't necessarily see him, but she recognized his voice. Because of her joy, she's so excited, she did not open the gate. Logically, you'd think, well, you should have opened the gate. But she was just so excited. Peter is out here. What in the world? And so she ran in and reported that Peter was standing in front of the gate. And so this picture depicts, like a little opening there where maybe she saw him. It doesn't indicate that she saw him, but she recognized Peter's voice and then just ran in and talked to the other Christians who were there praying. And they said to her in verse 15, "You are out of your mind. You're crazy. He's in prison. What are you talking about?" But she kept insisting. He's at the gate. He's out there. He's knocking. I heard him. It is so. And they kept saying, well, it is his angel. And of course, this kind of speaks to the idea of a guardian angel or these different ideas that some of the Jewish people had at the time. But of course, there was an angel, right? There was an angel, the angel of the Lord that helped him to escape. But that wasn't who was at the gate. It was Peter himself. In verse 16, he kept knocking. He just kept knocking. He's like, where did the girl go? What's going on, And when they opened the door, they finally came and opened the door. They saw him. They were astounded. It's true. This silly girl that said all this is right. And how in the world? How did Peter get here? He's in prison. He's about to be killed, just like James. How is he here at our door? We've been praying, but maybe they weren't really expecting that he would miraculously come there. But there he is. But verse 17, he says, motioning with his hand, hey, I just escaped prison. Shh. Don't tell everyone. You made me knock a lot already, but let's be silent. He recounted to him how the Lord had led him out of the prison. It says the Lord did it. Of course, the angel of the Lord, right? The angel of the Lord was doing the work of the Lord, and how he was miraculously able to have his chains fall off and go past these different guards, and the automatic gate opened up, even though that wasn't a thing back then. But miraculously, all these things happened. Report these things to James and the brothers. You might take a step back. It's like, well, wait a minute. James was just killed, so what are we talking about here? So be mindful here that this is talking about James, the brother of the Lord, the brother of Jesus, half-brother, right, because of Mary and Joseph and all that. James and Jude, of course, were some of the brothers of Jesus who did not believe him when he walked the earth, but then after he rose from the dead, they did believe. So we could see, like in Galatians chapter 1, verse 19, where Paul refers to having met James, the brother of the Lord. That's who this is. So we're not talking about the one who was just killed. And so James, the brother of the Lord, became a leader in the church in Jerusalem, kind of like Peter had done. But of course, Peter is kind of going off in some travels here. So we see, of course, in all this, Herod is defeated. He doesn't really know it yet. He's still trying to play the blame game. He blames the guards. Well, okay, I lost my prisoner. That's kind of embarrassing, but it's the guards' fault. Verse 18. Now when day came, so all this kind of happened at night. It was coming to morning, and now it's sunlight now, morning. There was no small disturbance, and that's of course Luke's way to say there was an enormous disturbance. It was a bedlam, chaos. These soldiers realized we lost our prisoner. This prisoner who was going to be executed, and now that's going to be us. We've got to find this guy. What happened? And when Herod had searched for him, not found him. We can't find Peter anywhere. He's not like in another cell or something. He examined the guards, and that's probably a a nice way to say, kind of tortured the guards, and what happened? Why'd you let him go? And this sort of thing. And then ultimately ordered that they be led away to execution. So he scapegoated the guards. I mean, on the one hand, that was kind of their standard thing, but on the other hand, Herod wasn't supposed to be capturing this good man Peter anyway. This was all wickedness, of course. And then verse 19 kind of changes the scene there to, then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. So now we're talking about how Herod then travels. And on our map, we can see down in the Jerusalem area now, he's going way up north here to Caesarea. So we've changed locations here. So he's defeated, but he's still traveling. He doesn't realize it. He's still doing his thing. And we even see that Herod is worshipped. How could we say he's defeated? He's worshipped. The people are having this sort of conflict. It says he was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon up in that area. And with one accord, they came to him, having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, and they were asking for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. So there's this sort of political dispute between him and this other area and how they provided food. And so they were upset that they weren't going to get the food, and he was upset at them not letting them have the food for whatever it was. But this was going to be this time to sort of make peace. And so these people who were there to listen to him kind of wanted to butter him up so that he would give them the food as they wanted, provide for them. So in verse 21, that's sort of the context here for this speech that he gives. And on an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, his fancy clothes, and sitting on the judgment seat, began delivering an address to them. And the assembly kept crying out, again, they're wanting to butter him up, right? The voice of a God and not of a man. You're so glorious and great. You're not just some man. You're a God. You are deity himself. And so he's giving this speech, and these people are saying these things to him, which are really blasphemous. But he probably likes it. Oh, you're glorifying me. Now there's a history to this. These things in the Bible really happen. We believe that. But there's also other history that writes about this event. The historian Josephus, who was a Jewish man, he wasn't a Christian. He wasn't a Jewish Christian at all. He was just a Jewish man. He describes more about these royal robes that we just read about. He says that the garments were made wholly of silver. They were made of like silver thread to make this into a very fancy clothes. And so it illuminated by the sun. It was like reflective. And he says, illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays, it was so resplendent as to spread horror over all those who looked intently upon him. So it was so glorious. It was just physical silver and metal, but that people were just maybe thinking he's like an angel or something like that. And so, of course, they honored him in this way, and in a bad way, glorifying him as a god and not as a man. So, of course, that God does not appreciate that. And so Herod is killed. We see right there in verse 23, and immediately an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. Well, that sounds completely horrible, but he was not honoring God. And so we see here that similar to how it says that Peter was struck by the angel of the Lord, now we see Herod is struck by the angel of the Lord in a very violent way that leads to his death. So we see that he becomes sick. And again, if we would compare that to what Josephus wrote about these historical events, Josephus talks about how Herod suffered for 5 days with this and had this bad abdominal pain, and then he died. So the text here in the Bible makes this sound like it's immediate, but either way, the Lord caused him to die. These are pride's consequences. We should not take any glory away from God, and certainly not try to persecute the Christians. But even in the face of all this, or maybe even because of this, verse 24 says, the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied. And that's a kind of a phrase we just keep seeing through Acts, as it just, the gospel and the Christianity just sort of spreads from Jerusalem and goes out and out to the Gentile people, and now it just keeps growing and multiplying. even though some of these horrible persecutions go on. And then our last verse talks about Barnabas and Saul. Really, that kind of sets the tone for going forward. A lot of it talks about Paul's work rather than Peter here. But it says that they returned to Jerusalem. So we'll recall in chapter 11, they were going to take these the famine relief from Antioch to the people in Judea and Jerusalem. And so there we see them fulfilling that now. And then chapter 13 talks about their missionary journey. We'll look at that in the future here. But this morning we've talked about the power of prayer. We've seen it in action. These Christians who felt perhaps powerless, they were able to pray, and God answered their prayers in a very powerful way to save Peter so that he could spread the word of God even more. We saw how Herod persecuted the church, but ultimately Herod was defeated. In the big picture, Satan is against us, but ultimately Satan will be defeated in the last day. So as we think about the power of prayer in the face of what seems like insurmountable odds, we need to make sure that we're having that attitude as well, recognizing the power of prayer and not giving up on that. So we'll leave you with verse 24 here. It says, "The word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied." And we hope that that's occurring here today. We need to be all busy sharing the word of the Lord, glorifying his name, and sharing with those that are lost the good gifts that we can have, the free gift of salvation that we can have through Jesus Christ. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and the wages of sin is death, and that's basically what we deserve. But thanks be to God for his indescribable gift that he gave his son to die on the cross for us. And if we partake in his death, we're buried with him in baptism. We know that we'll rise to walk in newness of life here on this day as we would have that happen, as we would be baptized, we'd have forgiveness of sins. But also it speaks to the resurrection on the last day, that we would have eternal life with him. So if we can help you in any way with this, we're going to sing this song that kind of makes us think about Luke chapter 15. God is calling the prodigal son. Perhaps you've wandered away from your good father and need to come back to him. We encourage you to do that while we stand and sing the song.